The Texas wind blew dry and sharp across the rodeo grounds, lifting swirls of dust into the evening air. The stands were full, families in denim, old cowboys with cracked boots, and weathered hands resting on worn leather belts. But the chatter quieted when a woman in full military uniform stepped into the arena, walking alongside a large German shepherd. Her name was Maud Mast, and unlike the others, she wasn't dressed for show. Her pressed fatigues and steely eyes stood in stark contrast to the jeans and cowboy hats that surrounded her, and they noticed. Everyone noticed. "This ain't no military parade." Someone mumbled from the crowd loud enough to draw a few stiff chuckles. Maud didn't flinch. She kept walking, each step echoing across the packed dirt like a distant drumbeat. She wasn't here for applause. She wasn't here to win. She was here because she had to be. Because 2 years ago, on this very ground, her little brother Cody had died in front of this same crowd, thrown from a bucking bronco in a fall that left him silent and still before the dust even settled. After Cody's death, Irving Mass, their father, barely spoke to her. A stoic man with hands like split oak and a heart grown cold with age. He couldn't forgive what he saw as her absence. "You should have been there," he said once, barely above, a whisper, but loud enough to stay with her. Maud had been deployed then, half a world away, patching wounds and dodging mortar fire. But guilt travels fast, and it had a long memory. Beside her, Gus moved with calm precision of a soldier. His black and tan coat shimmered under the arena lights, his amber eyes scanning the space with quiet alertness. Gus wasn't just her service dog. He was her partner, her shadow, the only being who seemed to understand that Maud hadn't come back whole. The war may have ended, but the battles didn't. Not in her mind, not in her chest. And now she stood back in the town that never welcomed her home. She reached the center of the ring. The announcer hesitated before calling her name. There was no cheering, just awkward silence, and the sound of someone shifting in their seat. Maud bent slightly and released Gus's leash. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He knew, he always knew. The whistle blew, and as Gus took his first step forward, the crowd had no idea what they were about to witness. Maud and Gus's powerful journey is just beginning. Hit the like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. We're so close to hitting 100,000 subscribers, and you can be part of this milestone. Every single click counts. Join us now. The moment the whistle pierced the heavy air, Gus sprang into motion, not with reckless speed, but with deliberate, almost surgical precision. His body moved like a coiled spring finally released, each step calculated, his ears sharp and tail steady. The task was simple: guide 3 stubborn sheep through a marked obstacle course, just like every other dog had done. But the way Gus moved was different. It wasn't flashy, it was flawless. Not a bark, not a misstep, just quiet power. And slowly the murmurs in the crowd began to shift. Maud stood at the edge of the arena, back straight, fists clenched behind her back. Her face remained unreadable, but inside, her heart pounded like a drum in retreat. She knew what Gus could do, what they had trained for back in Germany, in the red sands of Kuwait, and later in the empty fields behind the VA hospital. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was home, and the people watching weren't enemies. They were neighbors, old classmates, the same ones who hadn't said a word at Cody's funeral. A little girl in the front row tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mama, is that a war dog?" The woman hesitated. "I think so, baby. But he's hurting like he's been doing it his whole life." That single sentence floated outward like a ripple in water, reaching even the stiff-lipped ranchers who had crossed their arms in protest just minutes earlier. Gus was halfway through the course now, moving the sheep with the confidence of a creature who had seen things no dog should. What no one in the crowd could see was what Gus was responding to. The slight twitch in Maud's shoulder, the breath she held in her throat, the ghost she carried. Every movement she made told him what to do. It was their code, their silent language. And in the middle of this dusty Texas arena, that bond, built in war zones and sleepless nights, began to unravel something in the audience. Confusion gave way to curiosity, curiosity to awe. As the final sheep crossed the finish line, a pause hung in the air like a held breath. Then the crowd began to clap, hesitant at first, then louder and louder. Maud's body didn't move, but her eyes did. They flicked toward the stands, toward a man in a flannel shirt and faded cap, Irving. He didn't clap, he didn't smile. But for the first time in years, he was looking straight at her. Maud felt it like a crack in old ice, just a sliver, something thawing. And then from the far end of the arena, someone shouted, "Hey, what's wrong with that man? Somebody get help." All eyes turned, the applause stopped, and Gus was already running. Before Maud could process the shout, Gus was already halfway across the arena, dust rising behind him like smoke from a fire. His instincts kicked in, not as a herding dog, not even as a performer, but as a trained service animal, a rescuer. The crowd parted instinctively as he charged toward the man who had slumped over in the front row, his body limp, face pale and slack-jawed. Gasps rippled through the stands. For a second, it was chaos. Maud moved fast, but her legs felt heavy, as if every step dragged years of weight behind it. Her boots pounded against the packed dirt, memories crashing in like waves. Med tents, triage lines, bloodied hands. She'd seen that expression before, a man going still in the blink of an eye. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. "Gus, stay!" She barked, but he didn't stop because he knew something she didn't. His ears were pressed back, nose low to the ground, tail rigid with alert. The man on the ground was in his 60s. Broad frame, thick arms, the kind of man who'd swung hammers for a living and never asked for help. His skin was ashen, his breathing shallow. A woman beside him was crying, shaking his shoulder. "Chuck, Chuck, honey, wake up." Gus circled, then laid flat against the man's chest, pressing his body close. It looked strange to most, but Maud knew exactly what he was doing, stimulating body heat, regulating shock. She'd seen him do it in the worst of places. Someone called for paramedics. A woman pulled out her phone, and the crowd, once so quick to mock, now watched in absolute silence. Maud reached Gus and knelt beside the man. She checked his pulse, fingers trembling. Weak, thready, but there, barely. "He's in cardiac distress," she said, loud and clear, her voice suddenly taking on that commanding tone, the one that used to snap young soldiers to attention. "He needs nitro or CPR." Now, within moments, a volunteer EMT burst through the gates. Maud stepped back just far enough to let them work, but kept a hand on Gus, steadying both him and herself. Her eyes flicked toward the stands again, and there he was, Irving, still not clapping, still not smiling, but now standing, watching. And then he did something she hadn't seen since before the war. He took off his hat. The arena was quieter than it had been all day. Even after the man, Chuck, was loaded into the back of the ambulance and driven away with sirens fading into the warm Texas dusk, no one seemed quite ready to speak. The crowd, slowly dispersing, left behind more than footprints in the dirt. They left behind a feeling, a shift. Something unspoken had settled in the air like the dust that lingered in the golden light. Maud stood alone near the arena gate, her fingers buried in Gus's thick fur. Her breathing had steadied, but her hands still trembled slightly, not from fear, from memory. Her training had taken over when Chuck collapsed, but now that the adrenaline had drained from her veins, she felt the weight of it all again. The eyes, the silence, the flash of recognition in people who once dismissed her. For the first time since coming home, Maud wasn't invisible, and that terrified her more than being ignored ever had. A voice behind her broke the silence. "You handled that real clean, Maud." It was Irving. He stood with his hat in his hand, his face unreadable. The last time he'd spoken to her directly, it ended with slammed doors and 3 years of silence. She didn't turn. "He's lucky Gus saw it first," she replied, her voice dry, measured. It wasn't just a statement, it was a shield. She wasn't ready for warmth, not yet. Irving shifted his weight, boots grinding softly against the gravel. "That dog of yours, he knows how to read people." Maud looked down at Gus, who sat obediently at her side, his eyes flicking between the two of them like he was watching a language, without words. "He was trained for war," she said quietly. "Turns out he's still fighting. Irving nodded slowly, as if the truth in that sentence hit him somewhere he didn't expect. For a long moment, they stood in silence, father and daughter, each carrying their own grief in different shapes. Cody's name wasn't spoken, but it hovered between them like a ghost. Irving looked down, then up again, eyes red for more than just dust. "I should have been there that day," he said, just 7 words. But they cracked something inside her that had been locked tight. She looked at him for the first time in years, really looked. And though she said nothing, her silence no longer felt like distance, felt like the beginning of a bridge. Later, that evening, long after the crowd had vanished and the dust had finally settled, Maud sat on the porch of her childhood home, Gus curled up by her boots. The old farmhouse creaked with familiar aches, and the distant sound of cicadas filled the spaces where words hadn't lived for years. Inside, Irving moved slowly through the house like a ghost, occupying the halls of his own memory. Maud hadn't been back in over 4 years, not since the funeral, not since everything broke. She didn't expect him to offer her a room or even a word. So when he returned to the porch holding a small, crumpled envelope in his calloused hand, Maud stiffened. "Found this in Cody's room," he muttered, as if the words were thorns in his throat. "Figured you should have had it back then, but I wasn't thinking straight." He placed the letter on the wooden step beside her and walked back inside without waiting for a reply. The screen door clicked shut behind him. Her hands hovered over the envelope like it might burn her. The name on the front was written in Cody's uneven handwriting to Maud, "In case I screw up." Her throat tightened. It was dated 3 days before the accident. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The letter was short, filled with Cody's typical sarcasm and terrible spelling, but one line stood out like a siren. "In the dark, you always protected me, Maud, even when I didn't want it. If anything ever happens, I need you to know I never blamed you. Not for leaving, not for the uniform. You saved more people than I ever could." Tears came quietly, without warning, slipping down her cheeks in silence. Gus rested his head on her knee, sensing the storm inside her. For years, she had carried the guilt like body armor, convincing herself she had abandoned Cody, that she had chosen duty over family. But here, in a few scratched lines of ink, was the freedom she never gave herself permission to feel. The screen door opened again. Irving stood there, not crossing the threshold, but not turning away either. "He was proud of you, you know," he said softly. "He told everyone." Maud couldn't speak. She folded the letter and held it against her chest like a lifeline. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a soldier. She felt like someone who might finally be allowed to come home. Have you ever received a message that changed everything, even years later? Drop a comment below. What would you say to someone who never got the chance to hear your words? The next morning came with a strange stillness. The Texas sky was overcast, and the air was thick with a humidity that clung to the skin. Maud sat at the kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling beside her. Across from her, Irving read the newspaper, though his eyes didn't seem to move across the words. It had been years since they'd shared a room without yelling or silence as a wall. Gus lay stretched out under the table, tail thumping softly every few minutes, as if reminding them both he was still there, watching, waiting. "There's another event today," Irving said without looking up. "Word's gotten around about what happened yesterday. There are skin if you and Gus will come back. Say folks want to see the dog again." Maud let the words hang. For most of her life, she had moved toward danger, not attention. She didn't know what to do with admiration. "I didn't do anything special," she said finally. "Gus did." Irving folded the paper. "Well, you raised him. That counts for something." She looked out the window, the memory of the crowd's applause still flickering in the back of her mind, like an echo she wasn't sure she could trust. The arena was just a few miles away, but it felt like a world she'd only visited in dreams. She thought about Cody, how he'd ridden proud and fallen hard, how he'd believed in people more than they deserved. Maybe that was the part of him she never let herself carry. "You think they'd clap if they knew I still wake up shaking?" she asked quietly. Irving met her eyes. maybe they'd clap harder. That afternoon, she stood again at the edge of the arena. But something was off. Gus wasn't beside her. For the first time since their return, he hesitated to come when she called. He stood near the truck, stiff, ears flat, not defiant, but wary. Maud's heart kicked into a faster rhythm. "Gus," she called. Again more firmly. Nothing. Her instinct roared. Something was wrong. She rushed over, dropping to her knees. Gus was panting harder than usual, his body trembling slightly, not from heat or fear, but pain. They didn't wait. She and Irving drove him straight to the local vet. The lights were too bright, the smell too sterile. As the doctor took Gus to the back room, Maud gripped the edge of the bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. Irving sat beside her, his hand hovering, unsure. Finally, he placed it gently on her shoulder. And when the vet returned, the look on her face said everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, as Maud sat frozen in the sterile white of the veterinary waiting room. The smell of antiseptic and fear hung in the air. She had sat in places like this before: military hospitals, tents in the desert, emergency rooms lit by diesel generators. But this was worse, because this wasn't a soldier she could command. This wasn't a casualty of war. This was Gus, her Gus, and he was hurting. The vet knelt beside her, her voice low and careful. "He's older than most working dogs, ma'am. His heart's enlarged and there's fluid in his lungs. Likely early stages of congestive heart failure." Maud blinked, as if the words were coming in a language she hadn't heard in years. "But he was fine yesterday," she whispered. "He saved a man." The vet nodded kindly. Sometimes they give everything they have, and we don't see what it costs them until the quiet comes. Maud nodded, but her mind had already gone somewhere else. Back to the base, to the explosion that nearly killed her, to the first time Gus stood between her and the fire. He had always known when to act, when to shield her. He'd carried her through her worst days, and now she couldn't carry him. Irving sat beside her again, silent, but his hand never left her shoulder. A quiet gesture, years overdue, but now the only thing holding her together. That night they took Gus home. He walked slower, slept more, ate less, but his eyes still found Maud's every time she entered the room. She set up a bed for him beside the couch and lay there with him, one hand resting on his rib cage, feeling the fragile rhythm of his breath. She didn't cry, not yet. She was too tired, too numb. Gus simply leaned his head against her leg, like he always had. The weight of him was comfort and agony all at once. Irving brought her a glass of water and sat nearby without speaking. It was the first time Maud realized how old he looked, how the grief had etched into the corners of his face like weathered leather. "He's a good dog," he said softly. Maud nodded. "He's more than that. He's the reason I came back, the only part of the war that didn't leave me broken." The room went quiet again, just the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the whisper of Gus's breathing. Maud closed her eyes, and for the first time she let herself imagine a world where Gus wasn't there to watch over her. The next morning, Maud woke to a silence that felt heavier than sleep. Gus hadn't moved from his spot on the rug. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, and his eyes, those loyal, knowing eyes, no longer followed her across the room. Instead, they stared at nothing, flickering only when she touched his paw. Her chest tightened. It wasn't just fatigue. This was different. This was the end of the road he had walked beside her for years. She didn't need a vet to tell her what she already knew, but she called anyway. The same woman from yesterday answered the phone, her voice instantly soft as if she'd been expecting this call. "We can come to you," she said gently. "It'll be peaceful. He won't feel pain." Maud thanked her but didn't hang up right away. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before finally pressing it down. When the silence returned, it felt final. Irving stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. Hat crumpled in his grip. He didn't ask what was happening. He didn't need to. "You want me to stay?" he asked. Maud nodded slowly, unable to speak. Her throat burned. Irving sat down beside her, closer than usual. Closer than ever, maybe. "He's not just a dog," Maud whispered. "He's the only thing that made me feel human again." Irving placed his weathered hand over hers. "Then you gave him a hell of a life." When the vet arrived, Maud knelt beside Gus and placed her forehead against his. His fur was still warm, still familiar. She whispered things only he would understand. Memories, promises, and one last thank you. As the injection was given, Maud held him, her tears falling silently onto his coat. No orders, no uniform, no mission. Just her and the one soul who had stood by her when even her own family hadn't. After it was done, the vet left them alone. The house was still. Irving didn't speak. He simply reached over and picked up Gus's worn collar from the floor, turning it in his hands. "He saved you, didn't he?" Maud nodded, still unable to meet his eyes. "He saved the part of me I thought was gone." Her voice cracked. "Now I don't know. What's left?" Irving finally looked at her. Really looked. "What's left," he said slowly, "is someone who's still standing. Someone Cody would be damn proud of. Someone I'm proud of too." Maud looked up, startled. The words felt like a salve on a wound she hadn't dared acknowledge. She didn't reply, but for the first time, she didn't feel alone in her grief. A week had passed since Gus's final breath, but the house still felt like it belonged to him. His collar remained on the mantel untouched. His blanket still lay folded on the end of the couch. Maud hadn't moved it. She couldn't. It wasn't about holding on. It was about honoring the stillness he left behind. Every morning she reached for a leash that wasn't there. Every night she paused by the door, waiting for the soft thump of his tail. Grief had a rhythm, and hers was now echoing in the spaces Gus used to fill. She had expected the days after to be quiet, but not like this, not so hollow. The house creaked louder. The coffee tasted different. Even her boots, when they hit the floor in the morning, seemed to land with a weight she hadn't noticed before. But it was in that silence that Maud began to hear something else. Her own thoughts. Not the chaotic noise of guilt and memory, but the slow, uncertain voice of someone remembering who she was, without a mission to run, or a uniform to wear. It was Irving who first suggested they go back to the arena. "They're holding a service," he said. "Not just for Chuck, but, well, for Gus too. Folks have been asking about you." Maud hesitated. The thought of standing in front of those people again, without Gus by her side, felt unbearable. But then Irving added, "You don't owe them anything. But maybe you owe something to yourself." And so, on a Sunday morning beneath a cloudless sky, Maud returned. The arena looked the same. Dirt, stands, flags flapping in the wind. But something had changed. People nodded when she passed. Some placed hands over their hearts. Children waved. A little boy, no older than 5, walked up with his mother and handed her a drawing. It was of a big brown dog with a badge on its collar. "That's Gus," the boy said proudly. "He's a hero." She knelt down, her eyes stinging, and smiled. "Yes, he." For a moment, Maud felt that familiar warmth again, like he was there, right behind her, tail wagging, ready for whatever came next. She stood and turned toward the center of the arena. The same place she'd stood with Gus, only this time she was alone, and yet not entirely. Back home that evening, Maud placed the drawing beside Gus's collar on the mantel. Then, for the first time, she picked up his blanket. Not to hold it, but to fold it away. Spring arrived quietly in Abilene. The blue bonnet stretched along the roadside and the air smelled of dirt, grass, and beginnings. Maud stood in the backyard of her father's house, sleeves rolled up, her hands deep in the soil of a garden bed that hadn't seen care in years. Gus's favorite sunspot was just a few feet away, now marked with a small plaque she had carved herself. "You served with honor. You stayed with love." She read the words every morning, not for him, but for her. Irving had changed too, in ways that surprised her. He still didn't say much, but he started showing up. With coffee, with tools, with silence that felt more like presence than absence. Sometimes they worked side by side without speaking for hours. Other times he'd tell a story about Cody, ones Maud had never heard. ones that didn't hurt as much as they used to. It was slow, uneven, but real. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the local VA office. They'd heard about Gus, about Maud's background, and were inviting her to speak at a veteran support group. "We could use someone like you," the letter read. For hours, she sat with it in her lap, unsure if she could carry that weight. Then she remembered what Irving had said. What's left is someone who's still standing, and maybe that was enough. The meeting? Maud didn't speak first. She listened to stories of loss, addiction, isolation, and ghosts that followed others home too. Then, finally, she stood up. "My name's Maud," she began, voice steady. "I served overseas. I came back with more than I left with, and not all of it good. But I also came back with a dog. His name was Gus. He didn't just keep me alive. He reminded me I still was." There was silence, then nods, then something she hadn't expected. Connection. That night back home, Maud sat on the porch while the stars appeared one by one, slow and steady. She held Gus's collar in her hands, thumb tracing the edge like a memory she didn't want to wear out. She thought about Cody, about all the things she never got to say. But maybe, just maybe, living was a way to keep saying them. In action, in presence, in healing. As the wind shifted and the night deepened, Maud whispered, "You can rest now, buddy." And for the first time in a long, long time, she allowed herself to rest too. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more real and powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Every story here has a soul.